I still remember the horror that gripped me on that camping trip. I was a counselor in training, but I always hated camping. The heavy bag, lack of toilets, and spiders that always found their way into my tent all added to my discomfort. However, things took a turn for the worse during this particular camping trip. The trip started like any other, with 30 people on the trip for counselors and training for real counselors. There were around 20 boys and girls between the ages of 13 and 14 walking in a single file line, up and down various trails. We were all talking and laughing, so the sounds of nature were hardly audible. We made our way to a dense, marshy area and up a steep incline populated with evergreens and aspens. I was not the most athletic person, so I found myself falling behind with one of the other counselors in training, Jordan, and 2 other campers who were struggling to keep up. The 4 of us started chatting, but in our distracted state, we began to fall more and more behind the rest of the campers. Eventually, the last of the campers faded out of view around a bend about 50 feet up the way. We kept walking at the same slow pace, but after 30 minutes or so, the trail started to level off, and I began to feel increasingly anxious. Not only had the rest of the group completely disappeared ahead of us, but we had entered a stretch of completely dead evergreens, half of which looked scorched by a wildfire. The other half appeared to have been killed by a disease of some sort. The eeriness of this landscape was punctuated by a small derelict cabin sitting in the middle of the scorched forest. It was seemingly untouched by the fire that had spread through the area. We were so enraptured by the scene that one of the campers screamed when a twig broke behind us. Jordan and I started laughing, but we quickly stopped when we turned around to look at where the sound had come from. Not 20 feet behind us, there was a haggard-looking man with a messy nest of black hair and a big, thick beard. He was slowly making his way up the trail with his eyes locked on us. He didn't appear to have any supplies on him, and we had no idea how long he'd been walking behind us. Being young, we were naturally freaked out. Jordan managed to give the guy a friendly response before saying to the rest of us, "Come on, let's go and get back with the rest of the group." As we turned to continue our way up the path, the man mumbled a question that was hard to hear. I was shocked when Jordan turned around to ask the man to repeat himself. "Going camping," Jordan answered. The man smiled before stating in a creepy and ominous voice, "Well, you better be careful." We nodded and gave a half-hearted thank you before continuing on to try and find the rest of the group at a much faster pace. Although the man had been walking up the same trail as us when we saw him, he didn't continue. He stood there in the center watching us as we made our way up the winding path, and eventually disappeared from his view. We eventually caught up with the rest of the group, and we told the adult counselors about our interaction with the man. They just shrugged it off, telling us the guy probably lived in that cabin and wanted to know what we were doing on his property. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man had somehow followed us when we finally arrived at the campsite. I never thought I would live in a world where I had to be constantly aware of my surroundings. It all started when I moved to DC, a city full of life and opportunity, but also full of danger lurking around every corner. I'm a small person, and people often mistake me for a teenager, which makes me an easy target for creeps. To make matters worse, I have seen some truly scary shit that has made me paranoid as hell. That's why I carry a fixed blade with me wherever I go. I strap it to my arm or waist, depending on the season, and while it's not the most comfortable thing, it gives me a sense of security. It was raining heavily that night when I left my friend's apartment. I was wearing an oversized retro windbreaker that I had just found at a thrift store. The knife was tucked away in my purse, and I was on my way home. I hopped on the metro, but the conductor announced that the train was going out of service before my stop. I texted my friend to see if I could stop by his place and smoke him up for a bit. He told me he would be on his balcony, and that I could just yell for him to let me into the building when I arrived. I settled into my seat and waited, trying to stay aware of my surroundings. That's when I saw him, a man across the aisle, facing me, who looked out of place. He was abnormally skinny, with greasy, dark hair, and he was wearing a purple button-down and tight pants. He kept talking on the phone while checking another phone in his lap, and I could tell he was speaking in Italian. I speak Spanish and a bit of Russian, so I can understand some similar languages. He was describing a small female with brown hair and a jacket, saying 괉ᴜ repeatedly. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I didn't know what 괉ᴜ meant, but I had a feeling it wasn't good. I discreetly strapped the knife to my arm underneath the sleeve of my jacket and texted my friend, hoping he could meet me at the station. But the reception was bad, and the text never went through. When the train arrived at my stop, I tried to wait until the last second to get off, hoping the man wouldn't follow me, but he managed to slip through the closing doors because of his abnormal skinniness. I started to pick up the pace, trying to lose him in the crowd. But when I turned around, I saw him following me, swiftly gaining on me. I started to run, hoping to find safety somewhere. That's when I saw a car stopped in the middle of the road, with the side door wide open. I didn't realize it was a trap until it was too late. The man caught up to me and lunged his hands around my waist, and I realized that I was in the middle of a horror movie. I pulled out my knife and stabbed him wherever I could, trying to get free. But he was surprisingly strong for such a skinny guy, and he had a serrated knife and a gun tucked into his shirt. I felt a rip, and I knew I had to fight for my life. I used the leverage of his grip to aim, and I slammed the knife under his button-down, pushing it in as hard as I could. In that moment, I realized how fundamentally defenseless I am. I couldn't scream or make a sound. I was just a small person in a big, scary world, and I knew that I would never. I felt like I was in some sort of trance as the man fell to the ground, writhing in pain. Blood seeped out of his wound and onto the pavement. I stumbled backwards, almost falling myself. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I had just killed a man. In self-defense, yes, but still, I had taken a life. I stood there for a moment, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do now? Should I call the police? Or should I just run away and try to forget this ever happened? I knew that if I stayed there, I would be caught and arrested. But if I ran away, the guilt and the fear would haunt me forever. In the end, I decided to call the police. I dialed 911 and explained what had happened, trying my best to sound calm and coherent. The operator told me to stay put and wait for the police to arrive. It felt like an eternity before they finally showed up. I was shaking and crying uncontrollably by the time they got there. They took my statement and examined the body of the man I had killed. They told me that he was a known criminal with a long rap sheet for robbery, assault, and even murder. I was relieved to hear this, but at the same time, I couldn't help but feel sick to my stomach. I had taken a life. Even though it was in self-defense, it still felt like a heavy burden on my soul. The police took me into custody, but later released me without charge, as it was deemed to be a case of self-defense. I went home that night, still in shock from what had happened. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't even think straight. Over the next few days, I was plagued by nightmares and flashbacks of that fateful night. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that someone was out to get me. I started seeing a therapist, hoping to find some way to cope with the trauma I had experienced. It helped to some extent, but I still felt like I was living in a constant state of fear. Months went by, and eventually the memory of that night started to fade. But it was always there, lurking in the back of my mind, a constant reminder of how fragile life really is. Looking back on it now, I realize that I was lucky to have been able to defend myself. Not everyone is as fortunate, but the experience has taught me to be more aware of my surroundings and to never take my safety for granted. And although I still carry a knife with me, I know that it's not a guarantee of protection. The world can be a dangerous place, and sometimes no amount of preparation can truly keep us safe. But we must never stop trying. We must always be vigilant, always be aware, and always be ready to defend ourselves if need be. Once upon a time, there was a young individual who preferred the pronoun they, assigned female at birth. They had a love for trades work that made them feel powerful and manly. One day, they enrolled in a masonry class that met twice a week for 4 weeks. The class involved brick and block laying, working with mortar, and learning the different branches of work for this trade. Excitement filled the air as the class began, and the young individual was happy to see some of their friends there. The group started working on small, incomplete walls, smearing mortar in preparation for block laying. However, things took a turn for the worse when they encountered the creepy teacher, or CT, as they called him. CT was one of 2 teachers assigned to the class, along with Anne. At first, the young individual found CT to be a little odd, but nothing out of the ordinary. That is until CT touched their arm unexpectedly to get their attention. This made the young individual extremely uncomfortable, but they tried to brush it off as a one-time thing. Unfortunately, it wasn't. CT came back and touched the young individual again, this time from behind, placing a hand on their shoulder. As if that wasn't bad enough, CT then leaned in close and whispered something about their technique in their ear. But the worst was yet to come. CT put his hand on the young individual's waist to get them to step aside. This was beyond inappropriate, and the young individual had never experienced anything like it before, especially from a teacher they hadn't even met before. The young individual was beside themselves with discomfort and knew they had to do something. At lunchtime, they found the woman who had connected them to the class and explained what had happened. She promised to take care of it, and the young individual felt relieved. Later, they found out that the incident had been reported to the bosses, and CT had been given a formal warning about touching students without their consent. He was also told to stay at least a meter away from the young individual and their work. The young individual felt better knowing that something had been done, but they couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered. To make matters worse, the young individual noticed that CT never touched the other students in the class, all of whom were cis men. It seemed like he had singled them out for some reason, and that made the young individual even more uncomfortable. As the weeks went on, the young individual tried their best to avoid CT and stay focused on their work. But every now and then, they would catch CT staring at them, and it sent shivers down their spine. They couldn't wait for the class to be over so they could put this whole ordeal behind them. Looking back on it now, the young individual knew that what CT did was not okay, and they hoped that no one else would have to go through what they did. It was a lesson learned the hard way, but one that would stay with them for a long time to come. Sit down, my friends, for I have a story to tell you. It is a story that will chill you to the bone and make you wonder about the world we live in. It happened to me, my father, and my brother in the summer of 2010 in Tuscany, Italy. We were on a hiking trip, exploring the wilds of the countryside, as we often do. We are a family of adventurers, you see, and we do not scare easily. But what we encountered on that trip was beyond anything we could have imagined. We came across an abandoned Tuscan farmhouse, nestled deep in the woods, far from any town or civilization. It was a small, unassuming place with a door missing and plants growing wild all around it. We shouted out, asking if anyone was there, but there was no response. It was clear that no one had lived there for some time. Yet, despite the obvious signs of abandonment, we felt drawn to explore the place. It was an adventure, after all, and we were not ones to pass up on an opportunity for excitement. As we entered the house, we found it to be exactly as we had imagined an abandoned farmhouse would be. There were cutlery and plates on the ground, a candle, and some old paintings, nothing of any real value. But then, we noticed an old wooden ladder that led up to a hole in the ceiling. It was a small hole, but big enough for a person to crawl through. My father, being the tallest of the 3 of us, could not fit, so I volunteered to climb up and explore the upper floor. As I crawled through the hole, I found myself in a small room. It was dark, with only a few rays of sunlight filtering through the boarded-up windows. I saw graffiti on the walls, which was to be expected in an abandoned house. But then, I noticed another room, and I decided to investigate. As I opened the door, I was hit with a putrid smell that made me gag. It was like nothing I had ever smelled before. The room was empty, except for a large silhouette in the corner. As I got closer, I realized that it was the body of a dog, a big one, with no fur and only rotting flesh. It was a sight that made my stomach turn, and I froze, unable to move or speak. Suddenly, I was brought back to reality by the screams of my brother. The barn owl we had encountered earlier had flown back into the house and almost hit him. My father yelled at me to come down, and I obeyed, telling him what I had seen. The look he gave me was one of fear, but he tried to hide it. He whispered for us to run, and we ran out of the farmhouse, never looking back. We never returned to that place, nor did we ever talk about it again. But the memory of what we saw still haunts us to this day. We were not superstitious or prone to fear, but what we encountered that day was something beyond our understanding. It was a reminder that there are things in this world that are beyond our control, things that we cannot explain or comprehend. And it was a reminder that sometimes the greatest adventures can lead us down the darkest path.